What if everything you've been told about dealing with your inner critic is not just wrong, but actually keeping you trapped in cycles of self-attack that grow stronger with every attempt to silence them? In the next few minutes, I'm going to share something that might sound impossible at first, but by the end, you'll understand why trying to kill your inner critic might actually be feeding it, and why the real solution lies in a completely counterintuitive approach that transforms your harshest internal enemy into your most powerful ally for growth. Most people spend decades fighting against that voice in their head that constantly judges, criticizes, and undermines their confidence. They try positive affirmations, self-love practices, and endless attempts to replace negative thoughts with positive ones. But here's what they don't realize. Every strategy they're using to combat their inner critic is actually strengthening its grip on their psyche and creating more sophisticated forms of self-attack that become increasingly difficult to recognize and address. The people who achieve genuine freedom from destructive self-criticism know something that the rest of us are missing. They've discovered that the inner critic isn't actually an enemy to be destroyed, but a misguided protector that can be transformed into one of your greatest assets for authentic growth and self-understanding. What I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you believe about self-talk, self-improvement, and what it actually takes to create lasting inner peace. This isn't about learning to love yourself through forced positivity or pretending your flaws don't exist. This is about understanding the deeper psychological mechanisms that create and maintain harsh self-criticism, and learning to work with these forces in ways that naturally dissolve their destructive power while harnessing their underlying energy for genuine self-development and inner wisdom. Have you noticed how the harder you fight against your inner critic, the more creative and persistent it becomes in finding new ways to attack your sense of worth? There's something happening beneath the surface that most of us miss because we're focused on winning a war that was designed to be unwinnable from the beginning. Picture this scenario that plays out in countless minds every day. You make a mistake at work, something relatively minor that most people would quickly forget. But instead of moving on, that familiar voice starts its commentary. You're so careless. Everyone probably thinks you're incompetent. You always mess things up when it matters. So you try to counter these thoughts with positive self-talk. No, I'm actually very capable. This was just one small mistake. I have many strengths and accomplishments. But here's what happens next. The inner critic doesn't retreat. Instead, it evolves. Now it attacks your attempt at self-compassion. You're just making excuses. If you were really capable, you wouldn't need to convince yourself of it. You're delusional if you think that mistake doesn't matter. Other people don't need to give themselves pep talks because they actually are competent. You find yourself fighting on multiple fronts, defending against the original criticism while also defending against criticism of your defense strategies. This creates what psychologists call a double bind, a situation where every response feeds the very problem you're trying to solve. When you accept the criticism, you reinforce the inner critic's authority over your self-worth. When you fight against it, you validate its importance and give it more attention and energy. When you try to ignore it, it often returns with increased intensity, like a child acting out to get attention from a distracted parent. The real tragedy isn't just that this internal warfare is exhausting, it's that it completely obscures the original function of self-evaluation, which is to support your growth and help you navigate life more effectively. Your inner critic began as a legitimate psychological function designed to help you recognize areas for improvement, anticipate social consequences, and maintain standards that serve your long-term well-being. But somewhere along the way, this function became corrupted into a destructive force that attacks your fundamental worth rather than addressing specific behaviors or choices. Most people approach their inner critic like they're trying to win a debate against an opponent who has unlimited access to your most vulnerable memories, deepest fears, and every piece of evidence that could possibly be used against you. This opponent also has the advantage of never needing to rest, never running out of material, and having intimate knowledge of exactly which attacks will cause the most psychological damage. The deeper root cause of persistent inner criticism isn't actually about your flaws, mistakes, or inadequacies. It's about a fundamental misunderstanding of what self-evaluation is supposed to accomplish and how to engage with it constructively. Most inner critics develop during childhood as strategies for gaining approval, avoiding rejection, or maintaining connection with caregivers who had their own unresolved issues with self-worth and criticism. Consider what happens when you try to eliminate all forms of self-evaluation and critical thinking about your own behavior. Without any internal feedback mechanism, you lose the capacity for self-reflection, personal growth, and course correction when your actions aren't serving your highest good. The goal isn't to eliminate your inner voice entirely, it's to transform it from a destructive force into a wise counselor that supports rather than sabotages your development. The most insidious aspect of inner critic warfare is how it creates a split in your psyche where part of you is constantly attacking another part of you, leaving very little energy available for actually living your life, pursuing your goals, or contributing meaningfully to the world around you. You become so preoccupied with internal battles that external opportunities for growth, connection, and fulfillment pass by unnoticed. What's truly exhausting about this pattern is how it turns every experience into potential ammunition for self-attack. Successes become evidence that you're not as successful as you should be. Compliments become reminders of areas where you don't deserve praise. Failures become confirmation of fundamental inadequacy rather than information about areas where different approaches might be more effective. The questions that matter most are these. What if your inner critic isn't actually trying to hurt you, but is using the only strategies it knows to try to help you? What if the harsh self-criticism is a misguided attempt to motivate improvement or prevent future pain? What if the real solution isn't destroying this voice, but teaching it more effective and compassionate ways to serve your growth and well-being? When you begin to explore these possibilities honestly, everything shifts about how you understand and relate to your internal self-talk patterns. Let me tell you about Rachel, a successful marketing executive who discovered the secret to inner critic transformation through what initially felt like complete psychological breakdown. For years, Rachel had been driven by an incredibly harsh internal voice that criticized everything from her work performance to her appearance, relationships, and basic worth as a person. She had tried countless self-help approaches, therapy techniques, and spiritual practices, but nothing seemed to provide lasting relief from the constant stream of self-attacking thoughts. Rachel's inner critic had developed during childhood with perfectionist parents who expressed love through achievement and criticism. By adulthood, she had internalized their voices so completely that she barely noticed how much of her mental energy was consumed by self-evaluation and self-attack. She had become incredibly successful externally, but internally felt like she was constantly failing to meet impossible standards that seemed to rise higher with every accomplishment. The crisis came during a particularly stressful period when Rachel was competing for a major promotion while dealing with relationship difficulties and health issues. The inner critic went into overdrive, creating such intense self-attacking thoughts that Rachel found herself unable to sleep, focus, or function normally. She felt like she was being psychologically tortured by her own mind, with no escape from the constant barrage of criticism and judgment. Traditional approaches weren't helping because they focused on fighting against or replacing the critical thoughts rather than understanding their underlying function. Rachel's breakthrough came when she worked with a therapist who introduced her to a radically different approach based on internal family systems therapy and mindfulness principles. Instead of trying to eliminate her inner critic, Rachel began to develop curiosity about it. She started asking questions like, what is this voice trying to protect me from? And what does it believe will happen if it stops being so vigilant? Through this investigation, she discovered that her inner critic was desperately trying to prevent the rejection, abandonment, and disapproval that her childhood self had experienced when she didn't meet her parents' expectations. The inner critic had learned that by attacking her first, it could supposedly prevent others from attacking her. If it could point out all her flaws and mistakes before anyone else could, maybe she could fix them and avoid the painful experience of external criticism or rejection. This voice genuinely believed it was protecting her, even though its methods were causing tremendous psychological damage. Once Rachel understood the protective intent behind the criticism, everything changed about how she related to it. Instead of fighting against these thoughts, she began responding to them with curiosity and compassion. When the voice said, "You're going to embarrass yourself in that presentation," instead of arguing or feeling attacked, she might respond internally with something like, "I hear that you're worried about me being judged. Thank you for trying to help. What specifically are you concerned about?" This shift from combat to conversation created space for the inner critic to share its deeper concerns rather than just attacking. Rachel discovered that underneath the harsh criticism were often legitimate concerns about preparation, boundaries, or values that could be addressed constructively. But because the criticism was delivered in such attacking language, these useful insights had been lost in the emotional turmoil of feeling judged and rejected by her own mind. Over time, Rachel learned to distinguish between the protective intention of self-evaluation and the destructive delivery methods her inner critic had developed. She began to teach this voice more effective ways to support her growth, ways that felt empowering rather than diminishing, helpful rather than harmful. The critical voice gradually transformed into what she called her wise counselor, a part of her psyche that could offer honest feedback and helpful guidance without the emotional violence of constant self-attack. This reveals a fundamental principle that transforms everything about inner critic work. Your harshest internal voice is usually a part of your psyche that cares about you deeply but has learned dysfunctional strategies for expressing that care. When you approach it with curiosity rather than combat, understanding rather than resistance, it can evolve into one of your most valuable resources for authentic self-awareness and growth. Like a guard dog that has been trained to attack everyone who approaches, including family members, the inner critic needs retraining rather than elimination. The underlying protective instinct is valuable, but the methods need to be updated to serve your current life rather than defending against threats that may no longer exist or using strategies that create more problems than they solve. Here's what transforms everything about inner critic work. Your internal critical voice is not actually a single entity, but a complex system of protective mechanisms that can be understood, negotiated with, and gradually retrained to serve your highest good rather than sabotaging your peace and progress. This insight unlocks a completely different approach that works with your psyche's natural healing intelligence rather than against it. Let me tell you about Dr. Michael Torres, a clinical psychologist who stumbled upon this principle while struggling with his own severe inner critic during his training years. Michael had always been academically successful, but the pressure of graduate school triggered an internal voice so harsh and unrelenting that it nearly derailed his career before it began. Traditional cognitive behavioral approaches helped temporarily, but the critical thoughts always returned with renewed intensity. The breakthrough came when Michael began studying internal family systems therapy and neuroscience research on self-compassion. He discovered that what he had been thinking of as his inner critic was actually a collection of different internal voices, each with its own history, protective function, and underlying concerns. Some parts of his psyche were trying to prevent academic failure, others were attempting to avoid social rejection, and still others were working to maintain the high standards that had brought him success in the past. When Michael began approaching these voices individually rather than fighting against them as a monolithic enemy, remarkable changes began to occur. He discovered that the voice that attacked his academic performance was actually trying to help him maintain the excellence that had earned his parents' approval and love during childhood. The part that criticized his social interactions was attempting to prevent the isolation and rejection he had experienced during awkward teenage years. Most importantly, Michael realized that these protective voices had never learned to update their strategies based on his current capabilities, resources, and life circumstances. They were still operating from outdated information about his vulnerabilities and using primitive psychological defense mechanisms that had been appropriate for earlier life stages but were now creating more problems than they solved. The transformation process involved what Michael called internal negotiation, developing the capacity to have conscious conversations with different aspects of his psyche rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. When the academic perfectionist voice became active, instead of either submitting to its demands or fighting against them, Michael would engage with it directly. "I understand you want me to succeed and you're worried about failure. What specifically are you concerned about? And how can we address those concerns in ways that feel supportive rather than attacking?" This approach revealed that most of the inner critic's harsh delivery was actually frustration at not being heard or understood. When these protective voices felt acknowledged and respected, they became much more willing to collaborate rather than dominate. The perfectionist part could contribute its valuable attention to detail and high standards without the emotional violence of constant self-attack. The social protection voice could offer useful insights about relationships and communication without the paralyzing fear of rejection. Over months of practice, Michael's internal landscape transformed from a battlefield into something more like a council of advisors. Different aspects of his psyche could offer their perspectives and concerns, but his conscious adult self remained in charge of making final decisions about how to respond to challenges and opportunities. This reveals the counterintuitive truth that revolutionizes inner critic work. The goal isn't to eliminate internal critical voices, but to help them evolve from primitive attack modes into sophisticated guidance systems that support rather than sabotage your growth and well-being. The criticism itself often contains valuable information, but the delivery method needs to be updated to serve your current life rather than defending against threats from your past. While most people exhaust themselves fighting against their inner critic, true transformation comes from developing the capacity to lead your internal system with compassion and wisdom. This doesn't mean accepting destructive self-talk, but rather understanding the underlying needs and concerns that drive it so these can be addressed more effectively. The principle works because it aligns with how the psyche actually heals and integrates rather than fighting against natural psychological processes. When internal conflicts are approached with curiosity and compassion, the energy that was previously locked up in internal warfare becomes available for creative expression, meaningful relationships, and authentic contribution to the world. Think of how a skilled mediator approaches conflict between two parties. They don't try to eliminate one side or force agreement, but rather create space for each perspective to be heard and understood so that mutually beneficial solutions can emerge. Your relationship with your inner critic can follow a similar process. Instead of trying to win a war, you can learn to facilitate peace negotiations that honor the legitimate concerns on all sides while establishing healthier ways of addressing them. This understanding transforms every moment of self-criticism from an attack to endure into an opportunity to practice internal leadership and self-compassion. Instead of being victimized by harsh self-talk, you can learn to respond to it as information about parts of your psyche that need attention, understanding, or updated strategies for achieving their protective goals. When you understand that inner critic transformation is about evolution rather than elimination, everything becomes possible. You don't need to become a different person. You just need to help the person you already are learn more effective ways of supporting your growth, protecting your well-being, and navigating life's challenges with wisdom rather than self-attack. The foundation of inner critic transformation rests on 4 interconnected pillars that work together to create sustainable internal peace while maintaining healthy self-awareness and motivation for growth. Unlike approaches that focus on fighting negative thoughts, these foundations address the deeper psychological structures that generate and maintain self-critical patterns. The first foundation involves developing sophisticated awareness of your internal landscape rather than being unconsciously controlled by whatever voice happens to be loudest at any given moment. Most people experience their thoughts as a single stream of consciousness. But inner critic transformation requires learning to distinguish between different internal voices, each with its own perspective, agenda, and emotional tone. Internal awareness starts with what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to observe your own thinking processes rather than being completely identified with them. This includes noticing when critical thoughts arise, what triggers them, how they feel in your body, and what emotional responses they generate. The goal isn't to stop these thoughts, but to develop the capacity to witness them with some degree of objectivity. Practice this by spending time each day simply observing your internal commentary without immediately reacting to it. Notice the difference between thoughts that feel supportive and encouraging versus those that feel attacking or diminishing. Pay attention to which situations, people, or activities trigger more critical internal voices and which environments support more compassionate self-talk. The awareness aspect includes learning to identify the specific sub-personalities or internal voices that contribute to your self-critical patterns. You might notice a perfectionist voice that demands flawless performance, an anxious voice that anticipates catastrophic outcomes, a comparing voice that measures your worth against others' achievements, or a punishing voice that attacks you for past mistakes. Each of these voices has its own history and protective function. Internal awareness also involves recognizing the physical sensations and emotional states that accompany different types of self-criticism. How does perfectionist self-attack feel different in your body than social anxiety criticism? What happens to your breathing, posture, and energy when harsh internal voices become active? This somatic awareness provides valuable information about which internal systems are activated and how to respond appropriately. Develop the capacity to step back from intense self-critical episodes and observe them with curiosity rather than being completely overwhelmed by them. This might involve imagining yourself as a compassionate scientist studying an interesting psychological phenomenon, rather than being the victim of an internal attack. The goal is creating enough internal space that you can respond consciously rather than being completely reactive to whatever critical voice emerges. The second foundation involves learning to engage with your internal critical voices through conscious conversation rather than unconscious submission or reactive resistance. This means developing the capacity to communicate with different aspects of your psyche as if they were real people with legitimate concerns that deserve respectful attention, even when their delivery methods are problematic. Compassionate dialogue starts with the recognition that inner critical voices usually have protective intentions, even when their methods are harmful. The perfectionist voice is trying to help you succeed and avoid failure. The anxious voice is attempting to prevent future pain or rejection. The comparing voice believes it's motivating you to improve. When you approach these voices with curiosity about their positive intentions, they become much more willing to collaborate rather than dominate. Practice asking your inner critic direct questions when it becomes active. What are you worried about? What are you trying to protect me from? What do you need me to understand? This shifts the dynamic from being attacked by an enemy to receiving information from a concerned but misguided advisor. Often, you'll discover legitimate concerns underneath the harsh criticism that can be addressed more constructively. The dialogue aspect includes learning to set appropriate boundaries with internal voices that become abusive or destructive. You can acknowledge their concerns while refusing to accept attacking language or unreasonable demands. This might sound like, "I hear that you're worried about my performance, and I appreciate that you want me to succeed, but I'm not willing to be spoken to in ways that feel attacking. Can you share your concerns in language that feels supportive?" Compassionate dialogue also involves teaching your internal critical voices more effective ways to support your growth and well-being. Instead of harsh criticism that creates shame and paralysis, these voices can learn to offer specific, actionable feedback that feels empowering rather than diminishing. The goal is helping them evolve from primitive attack modes into sophisticated guidance systems. Develop the capacity to respond to internal criticism with the same compassion you would offer a friend who was struggling with similar concerns. This doesn't mean accepting destructive self-talk, but rather modeling the kind of supportive, honest communication that actually promotes positive change rather than defensive reactions or emotional collapse. The third foundation focuses on helping your internal protective voices learn updated strategies that serve your current life circumstances rather than defending against threats that may no longer exist or using methods that create more problems than they solve. This involves understanding the historical development of your self-critical patterns and gradually teaching these voices more effective approaches. Protective retraining starts with investigating the origins of your specific self-critical patterns. What childhood experiences taught your psyche that harsh self-criticism was necessary for safety, love, or acceptance? What threats was your developing mind trying to protect against when these voices first developed? Understanding the original context helps you respond to internal criticism with appropriate compassion rather than self-judgment. This foundation includes helping your protective voices recognize how much your life circumstances, capabilities, and resources have changed since these patterns first developed. The strategies that may have been necessary for survival in a dysfunctional family system or hostile school environments are likely counterproductive in your current adult relationships and professional contexts. Practice providing your internal critical voices with updated information about your current situation. When the voice that fears rejection becomes active, you might remind it about the supportive relationships you've built, the social skills you've developed, and the evidence that you can handle disappointment without being devastated. This helps these voices gradually update their threat assessments based on current rather than historical data. Protective retraining also involves helping your internal voices learn more effective methods for achieving their protective goals. Instead of using shame and criticism to motivate improvement, these voices can learn to offer encouragement, specific feedback, and practical suggestions. Instead of trying to prevent all possible failures, they can focus on helping you develop resilience and learning mindsets that allow you to benefit from setbacks rather than being devastated by them. The goal is teaching your internal protective system that collaboration and compassion are more effective than domination and criticism for achieving the safety, success, and connection they're ultimately trying to secure. This retraining process requires patience and consistency, as these voices are often deeply habituated to their familiar strategies and may need considerable evidence that new approaches actually work better. The fourth foundation involves developing your capacity to lead your internal system with wisdom and compassion rather than being unconsciously controlled by whichever voice happens to be most active at any given moment. This means strengthening what psychologists call yourself, the centered, wise, compassionate part of your psyche that can hold space for all your internal voices while making conscious choices about how to respond to life's challenges. Integrated leadership starts with recognizing that you are not your thoughts, emotions, or internal voices, but rather the awareness that can observe and interact with all these psychological phenomena. This doesn't mean disconnecting from your inner experience, but rather developing the capacity to relate to it from a place of centered choice rather than unconscious reactivity. This foundation includes learning to make decisions from your wise adult self rather than from your most triggered or anxious internal voices. When facing important choices, you can consciously check in with different aspects of your psyche to gather information and perspectives, but your centered self remains responsible for weighing this input and making final decisions based on your current values and goals. Practice developing what therapists call self-leadership by regularly checking in with your internal state and consciously choosing how to respond to whatever voices or emotions are present. This might involve soothing anxious voices, setting boundaries with critical voices, encouraging hesitant voices, or coordinating between different parts that have conflicting needs or perspectives. Integrated leadership also involves taking responsibility for your internal environment in the same way you take responsibility for your external environment. Just as you wouldn't allow abusive people to live in your home, you can learn to prevent internal voices from creating abusive psychological environments. This requires developing the strength and skills to intervene when internal dynamics become destructive. The goal is creating an internal culture of respect, collaboration, and mutual support rather than one dominated by criticism, conflict, or chaos. This doesn't mean eliminating all internal tension or disagreement, but rather ensuring that different aspects of your psyche can express their perspectives and concerns in ways that feel constructive rather than destructive. Develop practices for regularly connecting with your centered wise self so this becomes your default mode of operation rather than something you only access during crises. This might include meditation, journaling, time in nature, creative expression, or any activities that help you remember who you are beyond your thoughts, emotions, and internal voices. These four foundations work synergistically to create comprehensive transformation of your relationship with self-criticism. When you can observe your internal landscape with awareness, engage with critical voices through compassionate dialogue, help them learn more effective protective strategies, and lead your internal system from a place of centered wisdom, you create the conditions for natural healing and integration that eliminates the need for ongoing internal warfare. Transforming your relationship with your inner critic requires consistent daily practices that systematically strengthen your capacity for internal awareness, compassionate dialogue, and wise self-leadership. These practices are designed to work with your psyche's natural healing intelligence to create lasting change in your internal environment. Begin each day with a brief practice of consciously connecting with your internal landscape before engaging with external demands and distractions. Spend 5 to 10 minutes simply observing what voices, emotions, and concerns are present in your psyche without immediately trying to fix, change, or eliminate anything. This daily practice develops the foundation of internal awareness that makes all other inner critic work possible. Doing this morning check-in, practice greeting whatever internal voices are present with the same courtesy you would offer house guests. If critical voices are active, you might internally say something like, "Good morning, I notice you're here and you seem concerned about something. Thank you for your attention to my well-being." This establishes a tone of respectful dialogue rather than internal warfare. Set a specific intention for how you want to respond to self-critical thoughts during the day. Perhaps it's, "I will pause and listen for the underlying concern when criticism arises." Or, "I will respond to harsh internal voices with curiosity rather than resistance." Or, "I will remember that I have choices about how to relate to my thoughts." Having clear intention helps you respond consciously rather than automatically when challenging internal voices emerge. Include a brief practice of connecting with your centered, wise self, the part of you that can observe and guide your internal experience with compassion and wisdom. This might involve taking several conscious breaths while imagining yourself as a caring leader of your internal community, or simply remembering that you are larger than any single thought or emotion that might arise during the day. Throughout the day, practice engaging with your inner critic through conscious conversation rather than unconscious submission or reactive resistance. When you notice critical thoughts arising, instead of immediately believing them or fighting against them, pause and ask internal questions that help you understand what's actually happening in your psyche. This might include questions like, "What is this voice trying to protect me from?" Or, "What does this part of me need right now?" Or, "Is there useful information in this criticism that I can address without accepting the attacking tone?" These questions shift you from being a victim of internal criticism to being a curious investigator of your own psychological processes. Practice distinguishing between the protective intention behind critical thoughts and the delivery method being used. You might find valuable insights about areas for improvement or legitimate concerns about potential challenges, but these can be addressed without accepting harsh, attacking language. Learn to say internally, "I appreciate your concern, and I want to address the issue you're raising, but I need you to communicate with me in ways that feel supportive rather than attacking." When critical thoughts become particularly intense or overwhelming, practice what therapists call parts work by imagining these voices as separate entities that you can interact with rather than forces that control you. You might visualize sitting down with your inner critic to have a conversation about its concerns, or imagine yourself as a wise mediator helping different internal voices find collaborative solutions to whatever challenges you're facing. Develop standard responses to common types of self-criticism that help you maintain perspective and internal leadership. For perfectionist attacks, you might remind yourself that growth requires experimentation and mistakes. For social anxiety criticism, you could acknowledge the voice's concern while remembering evidence of your social capabilities and the support systems you've built. Learn to recognize the physical sensations and bodily responses that accompany different types of self-critical thoughts. Inner critic activation often creates specific patterns of muscle tension, breathing changes, posture shifts, and energy fluctuations that provide valuable information about which internal systems are activated and how to respond appropriately. Practice body scanning throughout the day to notice how different internal voices affect your physical experience. Does perfectionist criticism create tension in your shoulders and jaw? Does social anxiety criticism affect your breathing and heart rate? Does self-attacking about past mistakes create heaviness in your chest or stomach? This somatic awareness helps you recognize inner critic activation before it becomes overwhelming. When you notice physical signs of inner critic activation, use your body as a resource for returning to centered awareness. This might involve conscious breathing that helps regulate your nervous system, gentle movement that releases tension patterns, or physical gestures that remind you of your capacity for self-compassion and wise response. Develop practices for consciously shifting your physical state when internal criticism creates bodily contraction or distress. This could include changing your posture to something more open and confident, placing your hand on your heart as a gesture of self-compassion, or taking a brief walk to help process emotional energy and restore perspective. Learn to set appropriate internal boundaries with critical voices that become abusive, repetitive, or destructive rather than allowing them unlimited access to your attention and emotional energy. This involves developing the capacity to acknowledge legitimate concerns while refusing to engage with attacking language or unreasonable demands. Practice phrases that help you maintain internal boundaries while remaining open to useful feedback. Examples might include, "I'm willing to hear your concerns, but only if you can express them respectfully." Or, "I appreciate that you're trying to help, but this approach isn't working for either of us." Or, "I need you to stop attacking and start collaborating if you want me to take your concerns seriously." When critical thoughts become repetitive or obsessive, practice what cognitive therapists call thought stopping combined with conscious redirection of attention. This might involve internally saying, "Thank you for sharing your concern, and now I'm choosing to focus on what I can actually do about this situation," followed by engagement with constructive action rather than continued rumination. Develop the capacity to temporarily pause conversations with internal critical voices when they're not being productive. You might say something like, "I can see you're very concerned about this, and I want to give your perspective appropriate attention. Can we continue this conversation later when I have more capacity to really listen?" This maintains respect for the voice while protecting your immediate emotional well-being. End each day with conscious reflection on your internal experiences and how you practice relating to your inner critic with greater awareness and compassion. What situations triggered critical voices? How did you respond to these voices? What did you learn about your internal patterns, and what approaches felt most helpful? Review moments when you successfully engage with internal criticism in constructive ways, celebrating progress in developing internal dialogue skills rather than expecting perfect transformation immediately. Notice any instances when you were able to find legitimate concerns underneath harsh criticism and address them without accepting attacking language. Reflect on patterns you're noticing in your internal landscape. Are certain times of day, types of activities, or social situations more likely to trigger critical voices? Are there particular internal voices that seem to be most active or demanding? This pattern recognition helps you develop more targeted and effective responses. Set intentions for tomorrow's practice based on what you learned about your internal dynamics during the day. If you notice specific triggers or particularly challenging critical voices, how might you prepare to respond with greater awareness and compassion when similar situations arise? This reflection helps consolidate learning and prepares you for continued internal transformation. Once a week, engage in a longer practice specifically focused on developing deeper relationship with your internal critical voices. This might involve extended journaling where you write conversations between your wise self and various critical voices, meditation practices focused on internal awareness and self-compassion, or creative expression that helps you understand and integrate different aspects of your psyche. Use this weekly practice to address any internal voices or patterns that seem particularly persistent or challenging. Instead of trying to eliminate difficult voices, focus on understanding their deeper concerns and helping them learn more effective ways to support your growth and well-being. Consider working with a therapist, counselor, or spiritual teacher who understands internal parts work if you're dealing with particularly traumatic or deeply ingrained self-critical patterns. Professional support can be invaluable for learning to navigate complex internal dynamics safely and effectively. These daily practices work together to create comprehensive transformation of your internal environment over time. Rather than requiring dramatic personality changes, they support natural healing processes that gradually shift your relationship with self-criticism from internal warfare to internal collaboration and wisdom. As your relationship with your inner critic transforms from warfare to collaboration, you'll discover deeper levels of integration that extend far beyond personal healing into leadership, creativity, and meaningful contribution to the world around you. Advanced integration involves using your hard-won internal wisdom to create positive change and model healthy self-relationship for others who are struggling with similar patterns. True external leadership often emerges naturally when you've developed the capacity to lead your own internal system with wisdom and compassion. Leaders who are constantly battling their own self-criticism often project these conflicts outward, creating organizational cultures of criticism and performance anxiety. In contrast, those who've learned to maintain internal harmony while holding appropriate standards create environments where others can thrive and grow. Your developed capacity for internal dialogue becomes a powerful resource for understanding and supporting others who are struggling with self-criticism. You can recognize when someone's harsh self-talk is preventing them from accessing their capabilities, and you can model different ways of providing feedback and encouragement that support growth rather than triggering defensive reactions or shame spirals.
Advanced internal leadership involves using your understanding of protective intentions to help others transform their own critical internal voices. When you see someone attacking themselves for mistakes or perceived inadequacies, you can help them explore what their inner critic might be trying to protect them from and how these protective impulses could be channeled more constructively. This leadership quality becomes especially valuable in mentoring relationships, parenting contexts, or any situation where you have influence over others' development. Your ability to maintain compassionate standards while avoiding shaming or attacking language helps create psychological safety that allows authentic learning and growth to occur. Your internal integration also allows you to receive criticism and feedback from others without being triggered into defensive reactions or self-attacking spirals. This makes you more effective in collaborative situations and helps you maintain relationships even when difficult conversations or conflicting perspectives arise. As your internal critic transforms from enemy to advisor, you naturally become more willing to engage in creative endeavors that have no guaranteed outcomes or clear success metrics. True creativity requires a willingness to experiment, make mistakes, and explore unknown territory. All activities that typically trigger harsh self-criticism in those who haven't learned to manage their internal voices skillfully. Advanced creative integration allows you to start projects without knowing exactly how they'll develop. Share work that reveals your authentic perspective rather than trying to meet others' expectations, and persist through the inevitable periods of confusion and apparent failure that characterize most meaningful creative processes. You begin to see your former inner critic as a valuable creative collaborator that can offer useful feedback about your work without destroying your confidence or motivation. The same voice that once attacked you for not being good enough can evolve into a sophisticated editor that helps you refine your creative expression while maintaining support for your authentic vision. Creative expression liberation also involves learning to navigate the tension between maintaining personal standards and avoiding perfectionist paralysis. Your transformed relationship with internal feedback allows you to seek excellence without being trapped by impossible expectations or fear of criticism from others. The ability to remain internally centered during creative challenges attracts collaborators and opportunities that aren't available to those who are constantly battling self-doubt. People are drawn to work with creators who demonstrate genuine confidence combined with appropriate humility and openness to feedback. Perhaps the most profound impact of inner critic transformation is how it changes your capacity for authentic intimacy and connection with others. When you're no longer constantly defending against internal attacks, you have much more emotional energy available for genuine empathy, compassion, and presence with the people you care about. Your developed skills for internal dialogue naturally translate into more effective external communication. You become better at expressing your needs and boundaries clearly while remaining considerate of others' perspectives and feelings. You can engage in difficult conversations without being triggered into defensive reactions or attacking behavior. Advanced relationship integration involves helping your loved ones understand how they can support your continued internal growth rather than inadvertently triggering old patterns of self-criticism. This might include explaining how certain types of feedback feel supportive versus attacking, or sharing insights about what helps you maintain internal balance during challenging times.
You also develop increased capacity for maintaining your own center when others are struggling with their internal critic patterns. Instead of being pulled into their self-attacking spirals or feeling responsible for fixing their internal conflicts, you can offer appropriate support while maintaining healthy boundaries. Your modeling of self-compassion combined with appropriate accountability gives others permission to develop similar internal relationships. People around you begin to notice that it's possible to maintain high standards and pursue meaningful growth without engaging in self-attack or perfectionist anxiety. In your work life, the transformation of your inner critic often leads to breakthrough levels of performance and satisfaction. When you're no longer spending enormous amounts of energy battling internal criticism, you can channel that energy into creative problem solving, skill development, and meaningful contribution to your field or industry. Your ability to receive feedback without being triggered allows you to learn more rapidly and collaborate more effectively with colleagues, supervisors, and clients. You can acknowledge areas for improvements without interpreting suggestions as attacks on your fundamental worth or competence. Advanced professional integration involves using your internal awareness to maintain optimal performance states rather than being derailed by perfectionist anxiety or imposter syndrome. You can recognize when internal voices are trying to help you prepare or improve versus when they're creating counterproductive stress and anxiety. You become known as someone who maintains high standards while creating psychologically safe environments for others to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from experience. This leadership quality often leads to increased responsibilities and opportunities because people trust you to provide honest feedback without creating shame or defensive reactions. The ultimate expression of inner critic integration is how naturally you begin to teach others simply through your way of being. People who are struggling with harsh self-criticism are drawn to those who've learned to navigate internal challenges with wisdom and compassion, not because they need advice, but because they need to see what's possible. This teaching doesn't require formal credentials or therapeutic training. It happens through your willingness to be honest about your own journey with self-criticism, your demonstration of how to maintain appropriate standards without self-attack, and your modeling of what it looks like to receive feedback and handle mistakes with grace. Advanced teaching integration involves knowing when to share your own experiences and when to create space for others to develop their own relationship with their internal voices. You learn to ask questions that help people connect with their own inner wisdom rather than automatically offering solutions or trying to fix their internal conflicts. You develop sensitivity to others' readiness for inner critic work and can recognize when someone would benefit from professional support versus when informal mentoring and modeling might be sufficient. This discernment helps you offer appropriate levels of support without overstepping boundaries or taking on responsibilities that belong to trained professionals. The most profound impact of inner critic transformation extends far beyond personal healing into the legacy you create through your choices, relationships, and contributions. Every time you respond to internal or external challenges with wisdom rather than self-attack, you contribute to healing collective patterns of shame and criticism that limit human potential.
Your commitment to internal compassion creates ripple effects that influence your family, workplace, and community in ways you may never fully see, but that matter tremendously. Children who grow up witnessing healthy self-relationship learn different patterns than those raised in environments of constant self-criticism and perfectionist anxiety. Colleagues who work with someone who maintains internal balance while pursuing excellence often begin to question their own harsh internal standards and consider more sustainable approaches to achievement and growth. Your modeling of what's possible when internal warfare is replaced by internal collaboration inspires others to examine their own relationship with self-criticism. The ultimate integration of inner critic work is understanding that your journey toward internal peace isn't ultimately about personal comfort. It's about your capacity to contribute meaningfully to the world from a place of centered wisdom rather than anxious performance or defensive protection. Your transformed relationship with internal criticism becomes a gift not just to yourself, but to everyone who witnesses your willingness to pursue growth and excellence through compassion rather than self-attack. This demonstration of possibility plants seeds in others' consciousness that may germinate long after your direct interaction with them has ended. The journey from inner critic warfare to internal collaboration ultimately reveals that the very self-awareness that can create suffering when channeled through criticism becomes the foundation for wisdom, creativity, and authentic contribution when guided by compassion. When you understand this transformation deeply, you discover that your former greatest enemy has become one of your most valuable allies in creating a life of meaning, connection, and positive impact.